or even what we've offered before is stronger or weaker than the UK's protection of children in terms of what we have in front of legislation? Do you have an opinion as to that?
So I think the amendment we have before us is a preamble to the bill. If you're asking me about the bill itself and its actual obligations on entities as to their treatment of personal information, I would say we would suggest that the CPPA, as proposed, with a number of amendments that might follow, will allow for commensurate degrees of protection for children, including for the possibility of things like the design code to be a code certified by the Privacy Commissioner.
So, but how would it rank up to the UK? I mean, they have a UK's children's code as well too, and like I mean, I guess we don't have to do exactly what the UK does, but I'm just wondering whether or not we're setting ourselves up to do more, or we're setting ourselves up to do less than the UK. You know, they fell also under the same legal system as Canada and parliamentary systems, so I think that there's a decent comparable there because the United States doesn't fall in the same parameters in those two facets directly.
As I say, I think in pith and substance, with amendments, I think the CPPA will offer commensurate protection to children as that of the United Kingdom.
Okay. And so, what would be the, I guess, your opinion, the downside of, okay, let's see if we don't go ahead with the sub-amendment and the other amendments then go through, what would be then the downside to the industries that would then be affected by this? And how significant of a risk really is that? And if we have to, like, we already have a problem in our world with child labor laws. Even Google was actually, and then we also have AI issues in building AI. We have a significant, problem as civilizations of even treating children, even despite these declarations, with humanity. I mean, you look at some of even the United States went through this last year with some of their supply chains having children involved in brand name, companies. So I guess what my concern is, at this day and age, why would we risk potentially, at least this is what the information I'm getting for, is that this amendment would lessen this protection of children. Why would we risk that versus what is the benefit we get out of it?
So, Mr. Chair, I think the 2 points or considerations that we put before the committee are one, that we're desiring for ease of interpretability and implementation at outset of the passage of this piece of legislation, and that was our commentary around B of the sub-amendment. And then as it relates to C and D, it's to ensure that the preamble is specific to the legislation that it informs.
So you want clarity for the companies, but I mean, I can't imagine. So where's the big risk in this? I guess, is there a risk in terms of legal risk for the companies, or is it risk in terms of investment in Canada? In terms of not understanding if they with all the resources, all their lawyers, and all the money that they have, and everything at their disposal, can't figure it out, where are they going to be hurt from it?
Well, and I know the member knows well, Mr. Chair, but I'd say that the Canadian economy, so this bill applies to every single private sector organization transmitting and collecting or disclosing personal information. 99% of the Canadian economy are small and medium-sized enterprises who will have similar obligations to understand, interpret, and live out this act. And so I think important for us was that there is an ease of interpretability and of implementation for all of those commercial entities. And so I think the risk is, if there is ambiguity or uncertainty, that either they take actions that are ill-informed or potentially the wrong ones, or potentially they take no action and they instead choose not to engage in commercial service because it's simply too risky or unambiguous.
And that's a fair point, raising with regards to small and medium-sized businesses. I mean, we have these challenges and other types of policies related to taxation and so forth. So I take note of that, and that is a fair point in that. I guess my last question is going to be: is that if we do not pass this point in the bill, what would be the final, I guess? What would the government, or what would you see as an alternative as better? Is the changing or the amendments that are proposed that would come forth from that, without the without the changes.
So I can't speak for the government, Mr. Chair. I'd say if the sub-amendment fails, I think we would simply note our considerations around the interpretability, and then as I've said, the other two clauses of the sub-amendment which address issues for which we think might introduce either technology non-neutral language or potentially apply to acts that are not actually the subject of the legislation.
Okay, so we'll see when we get to that time, but a lot to think about for the short term. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Massé.
Thank you, Mr. Massé. Mr. Généraux, followed by Mr. Turnbull and Mr. Gall. Mr. Chair, I'll yield my spot to Mr. Garon because we've taken a lot of time. I'm sure that we can allow each person to have one turn. I'll take the floor afterwards. I appreciate your generosity, but following the list that has been established, if you yield your spot, I will put you after Mr. Garon, and I also have Mr. Turnbull. I can go after Mr. Turnbull. So, Mr. Turnbull, Mr. Garon.
Garon, if you put me back on the list. Quel comité,
to go right after.
C'est le meilleur comité.
This is the best committee ever. Mr. Garon, Mr. Chair, I thought many people are giving me participation points, so I want to thank you for the opportunity. I'm trying to understand, when we talk about the best interest of the child in Quebec, this is something that exists. We have cited the case law that exists in family law. It also exists in civil law, so it's well understood and it's well defined. If I understand you well, if we used the term best interest of the child in the bill or in the law, the fact that there are 10 provinces that interpret it differently, that's one of the issues, one of the problems. That's one aspect. The difference here is that the way we say it, the entity or organization that has the responsibility to interpret the consideration of best interest of the child is an enterprise. Who are the guides who have to influence any entity that has to interpret those concepts? And these are the reasons why we came up with these considerations. But there's another aspect. If a commercial organization goes along with its provincial interpretation, it may be different looking at the differences between the provincial laws. Question: there are federal laws that are interpreted differently in different provinces. I'm thinking, for example, about the law on young delinquents, because in Quebec, they take into account rehabilitation factors, and it's different in different provinces. That's not really a problem. Well, I don't want to spend an hour speaking like others. Well, I want to thank Mr. Généraux sincerely for yielding his spot to me. I hope he's not regretting giving me the floor. First of all, the Privacy Commissioner could come up with an opinion, any opinion on whatever he wants. Are there restrictions on that? If we include the best interest of the child, the Privacy Commissioner, can he or she decide to come up with an opinion on what it means, yes or no? In my opinion, yes. Looking at the history of interpretation of the Privacy Act, entities can use their interpretative capacity broadly. There's a former commissioner that used the interpretative powers in a way that was broader. I understand, but the interpretation powers exist. The commissioner could come up with his interpretation and come up with opinions. You also have the courts that will be called upon to interpret the act and to come up with legal opinions and come up with guidelines. So the courts could also help Canadian or foreign companies to apply the laws for the best interest of the child. Is that correct? I can think of two considerations to answer your questions. First of all, the department thinks that there's a capacity for the courts to do so. If there's an issue or a case that goes up to the Supreme Court or the Appeal Court, it's not a problem. It's really at the beginning. It's the commercial organization that has to interpret those considerations at the beginning. I understand. So how is this different from any other act? We write an act or bill, is adopted in Parliament. We state that there are going to be interpretative notions. If we prevent legislation every time the courts have to come in, then we may all go back home. One of the objectives of the bill is to consider or give enterprises the possibility of interpreting the law. So we want to have rules that are simpler and clearer. Something else concerning the courts, because you mentioned that the courts definitely have their own powers for sentencing. If there are facts that are established by commercial entities, it cannot be reconsidered. This confirms what I'm thinking, and this is something I told my colleagues. I have the impression that it may create a situation in Quebec where other people may be looking from outside. Well, it gives the impression that the law is written to facilitate the work of foreign enterprises. Quebec civil law is very complicated. The Canadian jurisprudence is too complicated. It's very expensive. We need to respect the imperatives of the courts. The companies are from California. They want to sell to our children. It's too complicated. Let's do everything we can to facilitate life for them. That is what it means. It gives the impression that a minister has taken a decision to go along with those companies. We do everything to facilitate things for the companies. And it's not the only place in this bill where we have the impression that there's this intention to facilitate things for the companies, where we know that there's also self-regulation and everything else. It's not the only place. I read the bill, and I have the impression that in spite of all the positive factors contained in the bill, we are trying to please the big companies. If we don't adopt the conservative amendment, I have the impression that we are putting aside the best interest of the child just because we want to please companies, and I don't like that. Thank you, Mr. Garon. I'll come back to Mr. General and then Mr. Turnbull. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I had not attended these meetings consistently since we've been working on this bill for 1 year, I would have felt that you were witnesses appearing on behalf of the companies and that you were here to make sure that we facilitate things for the companies as much as possible. And that's the truth, considering that we are here as parliamentarians to adopt bills, not because we want to please industry, because we want to protect Canadians. So that's my perception. I may be mistaken. And the fact that right now the Liberals have decided to come up with a sub-amendment which eliminates a term that is globally recognized. We are not inventing anything. This is nothing political. We are talking about the best interest of the child, and this is something that is recognized throughout the world. Even in California, we said so before. Many American states recognize this. So I'm trying to understand the logic, and I hope that Mr. Turnbull is going to explain this further. I imagine that you're working together to clarify. We had 50 amendments, and now we have 3 bills, and there's a link. And particularly with what is coming up. I'm 62 years old. 30 years ago, internet just came into our lives, we were still using fax machines at the time. And now, with artificial intelligence, things are even going to speed up even more. And there are lots of dangers that will be faced by our children. It is our obligation to make sure that children are protected. I don't know. Well, I'll ask a simple question. If we do not, or rather, if we were to adopt the sub-amendment without adding that line, do you believe sincerely that children will at least be protected than if we were to leave it out? Thank you, Chair, for the question. I would like to make a few comments in French, but let me, I will say something in English to clarify the point in French. To start, in my opinion, if the sub-amendment were to pass, it's the same protection for children and the same protections that are established in the bill.
I would note that comments about the ease of implementation are should be understood quite distinctly from the rising obligations being placed on commercial actors, which are replete throughout this project of law, that the CPPA definitively increases obligations, penalties, and responsibilities for commercial actors for the use of personal information. And so I comment only on that because the comments were made about whether or not officials are appearing here on behalf of any other interests. And I would just like to be absolutely clear that a primary consideration for the departmental participation in the establishment of this law was to ensure the effective protection of the privacy of Canadians.
Merci, Monsieur Chan.
Thank you, Mr. Chan. I am not accusing you of anything. A while ago, Mr. Garon said he had the perception that people may be listening and think of something else. We have 250 amendments, and we're still at number 2 after 2 meetings. We had said we'll take this seriously. We started last fall, and from the very beginning, most witnesses said there should have been 3 acts and not just 1, at least 2, to separate the elements. But now they're in the same act. So we must take into account everything. And so what I'm saying is that the best interest of the children, considering what is going to happen in the future, this should be in the act. The terminology that is recognized globally should be contained in the act. And once again, I hope Mr. Turnbull will explain why the Liberals want to remove it absolutely. So I'll stop there for now. We'll come back to that later on.
Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. General. Mr. Turnbull.
Yeah, thanks to all my colleagues for, I think, a really robust debate and discussion on this. I appreciate all your comments, and I think some really thoughtful arguments and questions to the officials. I think if I were to maybe start by saying, I think what we've expressed is a policy intent that is very much the same. Like, I think wanting to protect minors in a digital age where they are vulnerable to personal information being collected and used in ways that may not be in their best interest, I think is actually consistent with the overall objectives of the bill itself. And I think you've acknowledged that to some degree with some of the comments with regard to deeming all minors in personal information as sensitive. So I think we are aligned. I think there's, as the officials have said numerous times, I think the intent behind the sub-amendment, it was to try to provide interpretive clarity within the realm of commercial law, which is what I understand, that best interests is not a concept that's always known to companies. And I think Mr. Shan has made the point very clear. At the same time, what we're debating here is the language in the preamble of the bill. So I think expressing the intent that we all have, which I think we're aligned on, I think we should be able to compromise. And I would ask Mr. Shan a question. If you could just tell me, why do you have a preamble in a bill? Like, what is it really for? And it's actually kind of a very simple question, but I think it's fundamental to the debate we're having.
So a preamble obviously is a precursor to the fundamental obligations that a piece of law contains. And so the piece of law will follow with specific obligations and enumerate those in a number of ways. But obviously, a preamble gives the overall ambition and lens to those seeking to understand what those obligations are. And so it gives a sense of intent, and it also gives a clear notion of implementability of the obligations that then follow.
So in some ways, it just expresses the intent. It should be, and I think where we were coming from with this sub-amendment was to try and have a consistency among the approach and language to the bill, but perhaps more focused on the sort of legal interpretation of it rather than just the policy intent. Mr. Shan, could you maybe just remark on that, whether like having the phrase best interests in the preamble doesn't necessarily have, because I mean it is the intent in some respects. So I think it does actually express the intent that we share, and I think we've heard that all around the table. It's just that it's also a legal term that exists in family law and doesn't exist in commercial law. So I understand how the legality of that term could impact on what we want to have in the preamble if we're focusing on interpretive consistency and expressing that. But if we take a step back from that and we say, hey, the purpose of this bill as parliamentarians and that we all agree is actually to really protect minors. So in my view, I'm sort of thinking, sorry, I was getting to a question, but could you remark on, if the ambition or the purpose of the bill were expressed in the preamble, including best interests, it doesn't necessarily change the nature of the bill, other than the fact that it would then be interpreted as wanting to protect the best interests of children.
Indeed. I think the considerations we were attempting to put forward were about the use of consistent language that would ensure that the fundamental obligations that we see as so important that this law sets out are followed through on, which means that they're understood and can actually be lived out. And so insofar as there is the possibility of ambition being expressed in a way that maybe isn't the same exact way that it's then understood in the specific obligations, I think, as I say, it's a consideration around interpretability and legibility, but I think fundamentally the ambition that was proposed in the sub-amendment is the same.
That's helpful. And maybe just lastly to Mr. Jeannerou's points, and I think some other points that were made, which I think you sort of, Mr. Shan, reacted to a little bit with your remarks. That when Mr. Jeannerou said that it sounds like you're here on behalf of corporations or something, and I heard other comments like that. I just wanted to say, from my perspective, our reason for being here and undertaking this really important work, I think, is very clearly to protect Canadians, to protect children. but it's also to ensure the interpretive clarity that is needed to be able to live up to those obligations. And that actually is in the best interest of children, right? If companies, small, medium-sized companies, can't interpret this bill in a way that they can abide by it and that there is ambiguity entrenched in it that they can't possibly fulfill, whether, what maybe you're going to need a court opinion or something else, right? I think, so I just wanted to express the intent that I think we are aligned, that the ease of interpretation and the rise in obligations that you referred to are both parts of the same underlying objective and commitment. So I want to leave it there and then just say I want to seek unanimous consent to normally, so I know procedure from being on Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and I can't amend my own sub-amendment unless I have unanimous consent. But hear me out here. What I'd like to do is offer, in the spirit of compromise, collegiality, in the spirit of wanting to work constructively together, I would say, if you'll allow me, with the unanimous consent, I'd like to revert to the original wording that was proposed on the B, which was, whereas the processing of personal information and data should respect minors' privacy and their best interests. And I think if we can agree that then the sub-amendment that we would all support that I'd be happy to move that with unanimous consent if the committee will humor me.
A moment to have a quick
Yeah,
chat.
of course. So I'll briefly suspend. Colleagues, I think we've reached consensus. So everyone's heard the what Mr. Turnbull seeks to accomplish with unanimous consent, which is to remove subsection B of his sub-amendment.
Yeah, if I can just clarify to make sure everyone's clear. I think you're right. It's to retract the change to what we had in our sub-amendment, which was under B, to revert back to exactly the same wording that the Conservative Party had proposed, which is, and I'll just read it to make sure everyone is 100% clear. It would then read, whereas the processing of personal information and data should respect minors' privacy and their best interests.
And the rest. Okay, so do we have unanimous consent? Yes, we do. Amazing. So this we continue debate on the sub-amendment as amended. And I had on my list, if you're done, Mr. Turnbull, I had Mr. Perkins, Mr. Généreux, and Mr. Viss. Mr. Perkins, okay, so we're good to vote on the sub-amendment. If you no more comments, okay. So the vote is, or do I have unanimous consent on the sub-amendment, or do I need recorded vote? Unanimous. Monsieur Garon, je vous regarde. Ça, c'est sur le sous-amendement.
Mr. Garon, we are talking about the sub-amendment as amended. I believe I have the unanimous consent of colleagues. That's great. So this takes us to CPC 1.
Ça nous ramène à CPC 1.
CPC 1 as amended. Should we open debate on CPC 1?
Are there comments on CPC 1 as amended? Shall CPC 1 carry as amended? Yes. Yes? Great. The next amendment I have on my list is NDP 1. I don't know if Mr. Massé wants to move it or not at this stage. Yes, Mr. Massé on NDP 1.
I don't.
Pardon? Yes, Mr. Turnbull.
Just again, I had checked earlier whether the two were dependent on one another or overlapping, and I think we had heard very clearly from the legislative clerk that they were not. But I think what we've just done in sub-amending that and agreeing to that, the CPC 1, that I believe it's already dealt with NDP 2. Could we maybe just take a moment and verify that, and so we don't get snagged in debating something that is not needed? Sorry, NDP 1. Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about NDP 1, and it is true that there was a lot in common with CPC 1, but the end is not exactly the same. So if Mr. Massé wanted to move it, it would be receivable. But we can also just wait 1 second. I'll just briefly consult with the legislative clerks and come back to you. Okay. We still have 15 minutes, right? So we're on to NDP2. Okay, colleagues. No, because we started at 40. Okay, colleagues. So we have until 20 to 7. I don't know if you can say that exactly, but so NDP1, I gather, will not be moved because essentially it's been dealt with by the sub-amendment of MP Turnbull, which would bring us to NDP2. And just before it is moved, if it is moved, I'd just like to highlight that if NDP2 were to be adopted, G2 could not be proposed because there is a conflict of line. So should NDP2 be adopted? But I'll let Mr. Massé speak to NDP2.
Okay, so so the bill C227, I'll read this so people that are intently following at home. In Clause 2 be amended by replacing lines 16 and 17 on page 3 with the following, quote, modify personal information to ensure that no individual. And this comes, I'll just speak briefly to it and then maybe we can get into others could ask questions and so forth, from the Privacy Commissioner. And it's to strengthen the framework for de-identification and anonymized information. And so basically, it's to protect of de-identified and anonymized data, and it really comes from the Privacy Commissioner's recommendations that we've had.
Merci, Monsieur Massé. Monsieur Turnbull. Ensuite.
Thank you, Mr. Massé. Mr. Turnbull.
To Mr. Massey for putting this forward, and I wanted to. So my understanding is that Mr. Shan, maybe I'll start with you. Just that this specific amendment impacts the definition of anonymized information, and I believe it effectively removes generally accepted best practices as a concept from the definition of anonymization. Could you clarify that for me?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'm just...
It's interpretation. It's page 3.
Apologies, I'm just orienting myself on the bill again.
Page 3, there you go. Anonymize. Reverse me permanently in accordance with...
That's right. So currently the interpretation clause reads, anonymize means to irreversibly and permanently modify personal information in accordance with generally accepted best practices to ensure that no individual can be identified from the information, whether directly or indirectly by other means. And right now, the NDP clause would remove the in accordance with generally accepted best practices.
Now, if I were to sort of ask you what, like, having generally accepted best practices in there seems to me to be a pretty high bar and an important concept that would potentially allow for the evolution of those best practices in a way to be kind of referenced in the bill, and that high standard, because I mean, I think I come from a world and did work before I got into politics where, you know, promising and best practices were things that we often talked about, that they would emerge specifically in areas where technology or innovation was happening, that it seemed to be fairly commonplace for fast-changing industries to evolve quite quickly, and that best practices, and I would say promising sometimes practices, were kind of the precursor to eventually determining best practices. So can you unpack for us the impact of taking that out? How would that, you know, impact the bill and the strength of the bill?
I'd raise two considerations. One is this would not be consistent with the definition that currently appears within Quebec's privacy law, which requires information to be anonymized according to generally accepted best practices. And so there would be deviation between those two, which is not in and of itself necessarily. They are separate statutes, but in terms of company obligations and in terms of how they'll actually be able to live up to both of those statutes, where consistency can be found, it can be very helpful. The other is generally acceptable best practices, as you know, is a well-established kind of construct that allows for standards, certifications to be able to continue to keep pace with the movement of the technology and of the construct. And I think absent it, it suggests that you're held to a standard without the notion that you are in fact to draw upon the state of the art as it relates to the meeting of the obligation.
Thank you for that. And just based on your knowledge and having done a lot of consultation on this bill, do privacy experts generally want this notion to be kept in the bill from your perspective? Like, have they advocated for or expressed any desire to have best practices, generally accepted best practices, included in the bill?
One is the desire for a high bar as it relates to the to the construct of anonymizing, and that generally acceptable best practices as it relates to that obligation for anonymize is seen by many to be a high bar. And then second, that I think there is a desire for consistency of application of the construct, which is why generally acceptable best practices ensures that there's standardized approaches as opposed to a potential patchwork or highly diverse attempts at trying to get to the anonymization of information that may not that may introduce other vulnerabilities because people are doing it very, very, very differently.
Okay, thank you. And as you've said, this would put our bill out of alignment with the Quebec Law 25, I believe it is, or Quebec's privacy law?
Require information to be anonymized according to generally accepted best practices.
Maybe one more clarification question. Who decides what a best practice, a generally accepted best practice is? Is it subject to OPC guidelines as well, or how would that be determined and identified for people?
Could issue guidance, and certainly in the field of anonymization, there are lots of folks who've done work in this space. But there's also considerable effort underway by the standards community and others to set out appropriate mechanisms for that, which include civil society actors as well as academics, and then those who implement the construct in real time.
Okay, so thank you for all those clarifications, and I think Mr. Massey, that's why, at least from our perspective, I think Mr. Sean has provided a lot of clarification and rationale for why I would say our position is to oppose this one, just because we think that the generally accepted best practices portion of that wording in this particular clause is actually going to be quite useful to keep pace with the practices that are going to clearly evolve and emerge over time on anonymization. So just to provide rationale for our position, I don't know how others feel about this particular one, but certainly that's where we stand. Thanks.
Merci. MP Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think this is an important discussion. I'm sure this will spill over into our next meeting. And I thank the NDP for bringing up an important amendment. It's really important that we get the definition of an anonymized correct. We had a lot of witnesses that talked about anonymization versus de-identification. When I'm going to go off of what we were talking about before, the conversation was really about the balance between what business needs to interpret the risk, uncertainty, and then the balance of what the body responsible for enforcing the laws that are in the Privacy Act, which is the Privacy Commissioner, the OPC, have to see as certainty. So not uncertainty, but have certainty when they're interpreting the law for privacy. So we really, and based on our last amendment, we really rely on the Privacy Commissioner to give us the best definitions that are going to allow them to uphold this Privacy Act. Because under the Privacy Commissioner and then the tribunal, they're going to need those definitions to be exact. And just to give an example, the Privacy Commissioner, Philip Dufresne, laid out a case for his appearance before the committee in the fall for our meeting on October 19, 2023, and I quote, "This bill says that more than can be done with de-identified information and that if it's anonymized, the law doesn't apply at all." So there's a big responsibility that comes with that. These definitions need to be strict in terms of how they interpret those definitions in the bill. And I think that's why we're spending a lot of time, even though it's a preamble and even though it's definition, this sets the tone for the rest of the bill, the rest of the conversations that we're going to have. So Section 6.5 of this Act exempts anonymized information from all protections the CPPA establishes. And given that our argument from this side, you'll hear more than once, is that privacy is a fundamental right, we're making sure that we get the definitions right. And when we go through this, the Office of the Private Commissioner's submission from May 2023 talked about this piece and said, "A final report relates to the new definition proposed for anonymized information as currently drafted. Organizations could anonymize personal information using generally accepted best practices. However, there is no explanation of what these practices are or what would be considered generally accepted. Including this language opens the door to the possibility that some organizations might rely on anonymization techniques promoted by certain experts or groups that are insufficient for a given data test or insufficient for a given test to what we're trying to define and what we're trying to enforce under this privacy law." So this is why it's very important. And we do have a problem, and as the Privacy Commissioner did, with including that language, general best practices. I know Mr. Turnbull just asked some questions, but do we have a list, Mr. Shan, or do we have an actual definition, a legal definition of general accepted best practices? Or do we have a list that are going to be very specific for the OPC?
I think it's an evolving technology, and I think what generally acceptable best practices being in the statute allows is for the OPC to continue to pass judgment on whether or not the actions actually did conform to the generally acceptable best practices that have emerged. And I think we point to it as a means to encourage standardization of approaches and to ensure that people are living up to the best available opportunity to ensure the anonymization of the information.
And I think when we look at opportunity, we do want to look at business, and we were going to look at some of the burdens that they see from this act, and they've come to the committee. They talked about compliance costs, regulatory burdens, impact of innovation, competitiveness. But when we also look at the OPC and what they need certainty. They need to make sure that they have clear definitions. They need to be able to uphold the law. It's no different than we look at the Competition Act and some of the definitions and the ways that they've looked to interpret that to enforce the law. We've certainly been very clear that we want to see the protection of children, certainly that privacy is a fundamental right. But I think this is a big one because this bill is not for today, it's for the future. So when we look at de-identification, you'll hear this further in some of the arguments we'll present. It still states, even in the definition, it says there's a risk that the individual still be identified remains, as in the definition of de-identification, where anonymization removes that. But to remove more of that nuance, to ensure that